The State of Illinois Department of Transportation, or IDOT, owns and operates Main Street. IDOT is planning to complete improvements on Main Street sometime between 2022 and 2026. They have not yet begun their early planning efforts, but will do so soon. Our Great Streets project is perfectly timed to provide initial community feedback to IDOT to assist them in understanding how changes to Main Street can be directed to make a positive impact. The Great Streets team has collaborated with IDOT to understand what safety regulations and design requirements will be applied to Main Street so that a reasonable community plan is put forth for review. IDOT's requirements and regulations include a size limitation for street trees. IDOT will allow only species to be planted that will grow no larger than 4 inches in trunk diameter at maturity. This includes species such as redbuds, dogwood, and serviceberry. Unfortunately, this will result in lower and smaller tree canopy, which provides little pedestrian shade and often conflicts with large vehicles like delivery trucks and emergency vehicles. In addition, some early design concepts such as parklets and parallel parking spaces will not be allowed. Any vertical element, such as signage and lighting, can be implemented but must be approved by IDOT. Finally, the arrangement and the quantity of parallel parking is determined by MSCUDA. This topic will be explored further in the following slides. The following slides include a detailed look at our concepts for Main Street in 4 character segments: the West, Central, Under Construction, and East, as shown in the graphic on this slide. One small 2-block section of Main Street is currently under construction between Lebanon and Independence. This segment sets a precedent for future work on the corridor. The improvements here include a new red brick stamped concrete and decorative lights. As Main Street is rebuilt to the east and west, these design elements should be carried through to create unity. As you will see in the following slides, the red brick pattern is suggested for the traditional commercial section of Main Street between 2nd and Independence, whereas the lighting can be implemented for the full length of the corridor. The western segment of Main Street begins at 6th and ends at 2nd Street. The primary adjacent land use is residential, with buildings set back from the street. During our last presentation, we asked participants to vote for their favorite cross-section, and as shown, 55% of you selected the option with spaces for parklets and food trucks next to the driving lanes. We have since verified with IDOT that these improvements will not be allowed, but spatially they are the same as allowing existing parallel parking to remain. The primary change is to extend curbs to capture unused space along Main Street for tree lawns. The additional space between sidewalk and street is enough to plant small understory trees such as redbuds, dogwood, or serviceberry without the negative impacts to vehicles or pedestrians caused by the lower canopy height. The benefit is that the new tree lawns will add a green welcome to downtown Main Street while preserving the existing parallel parking spaces throughout this segment. This image is a rough sketch of what the proposed curb extensions and street tree plantings could look like if implemented on this section.
There are along Main Street 3 specific character segments that kind of hang together, and their uses are pretty consistent. And we talked about this in some of our previous presentations too. So if we started at the west from 1st to 6th Street, the character of this segment of Main Street is more residential, not entirely so, but it feels more residential. A few more trees, a lot more housing. Even though there are some commercial areas along that segment as well. The central segment is really the commercial core of the district from 1st to Independence. So that's really where most of the businesses and offices and retailing are located. And then finally from Independence east to mine, again, the character is largely residential, although it feels a little bit more like the edge of town, and there even are some quasi-industrial, sort of semi-industrial uses peppered in there. So these are now we deal with these in a little bit individual ways, and the ideas along these are somewhat different. So let's start from the west. Here we largely have opportunities for some infill residential development on vacant sites, for some commercial facilities as well, including the former service station at 2nd and Main. We have a good number of churches in this segment as well that are important resources. But probably the most important thing in terms of a focus in the west segment is the museum and Pig Creek, which is a special environmental feature. So we'll talk again a little bit later about the Pig Creek corridor and what that might be. But that greenway feature, drainage way feature with the historic museum seems to be a natural for a special place that can help tie Main Street to surrounding neighborhoods and also tell a lot about the history of Mascoutah. So here you'll see a lot of the different components as we get into a little bit more detail that happen in the planning for the area west.
The central segment of Main Street begins at 2nd Street and ends at Lebanon. The primary adjacent land use is commercial, with traditional store frontage at the back of the sidewalk. During our last presentation, we asked participants to vote for their favorite cross-section, and as shown, the majority, or 50% of you, favored moving the curb to increase sidewalk width evenly on both sides. As a result, the pedestrian space on each side grows from 8 feet to 12 feet, with a wide sidewalk and room for lighting, signage, planters, and benches. 12 feet is also enough for restaurants to add outdoor cafe dining while still having room for pedestrians to walk freely. The cost of this increase is the removal of on-street parallel parking, which is currently located on one side of the street. Red brick accent pavement can be added to this section to extend what is currently being constructed east of Lebanon. As mentioned previously, IDOT will only allow small understory trees along Main Street. The overall narrow width of Main Street in this section does not favor small trees, as the canopy will conflict with pedestrians and vehicles. The loss of parallel parking spaces can be accommodated in reorganized parking behind Main Street between Church and State, as you will see further in this presentation. This image is a rough sketch of what the proposed sidewalk extension can look like on Main Street.
Of First Street. The central segment again is the commercial core, and it's really highlighted by the railway and main intersection. And again, we'll blow that up and look at that in a little bit more detail in the next part of our presentation. But there are along this part of Main Street opportunities for reoccupied commercials, taking vacant buildings and using them more effectively. A few places for new development as well. Some residential growth around the edges, as you can see along Church Street, and very importantly, most of the parking that serves the district. And this is the place where we really can take advantage of the idea of cooperative parking and making the Church Street environment on the south side and the connections to Main Street really exemplary in terms of their convenience and welcoming to people who arrive in the district on some form of wheeled vehicle or other. So a lot of very interesting and exciting ideas here, but the most important centerpiece is railway in Maine. Additionally, many people in the survey emphasize the need to redevelop or do something with the parking lot on the southwest corner of Jefferson and Main, right as you come into town. And I think people were perceiving that that's kind of a weak entrance for a very important intersection. And yet, it's very strategic parking, so you'd hate to lose that as well. So we have an idea here that would establish market shelters along the south side of the street, which we can do by slightly rearranging the parking without losing very many parking spaces, and make that a much better welcoming resource for the community. And market shelters that look a little bit like railway platform shelters resonate for a town like Mascoutah that has a significant history with railroads as well. So those are key elements along the central segment, which again takes the existing commercial environment and works to enhance that. It's a complicated thing. There are too many items for me to include all on one slide, so there are two of these for you to look at.
Main Street between 2nd and Independence is proposed to be free of on-street parallel parking. The blocks behind Main Street already include large areas for parking but are inefficiently laid out. Reorganization of these parking lots into public parking spaces easily accommodates the losses from the new Main Street streetscape while boosting the overall number of parking spaces in the district by over 60 spaces. The success of this scheme will be dependent upon a partnership between the city and private property owners to develop improved lots which have adequate wayfinding for pedestrians and vehicles, as well as improved mid-block connections to Main Street. The reorganized parking behind Main Street will accommodate the loss of on-street parallel parking, but can only be successful if pedestrians are comfortable accessing Main Street. Many opportunities exist, as shown in the red arrows on the plane above, for pedestrian pass-throughs. Pedestrian comfort can be achieved in these spaces with adequate signage and safe lighting levels. Larger spaces are opportunities for temporary pocket parks, which can be open spaces for informal use or programmed for adjacent buildings to use for seating, dining, or outdoor shopping. The east segment of Main Street begins at Independence Street and ends at Mine Road. The primary adjacent lane use is residential, with buildings set back from the street. During our last presentation, we asked participants to vote for their favorite cross-section, and as shown, 70% of you favored fully expanded sidewalks with complete removal of parallel parking. The proposed design is intended to match the western segment to create a bookend approach that balances the arrival sequence for Main Street in both directions. The east segment of Main Street begins at Independence Street and ends at Mine Road. The primary adjacent lane use is residential, with buildings set back from the street. During our last presentation, we asked participants to vote for their favorite cross-section, and as shown, 70% of you fully favored expanded sidewalks with complete removal of parallel parking. The proposed design is intended to match the western segment to create a bookend arrival sequence for Main Street in both directions. Some parallel parking remains, but street intersections are supported with curb extensions and street trees. The additional space between sidewalk and street is enough to plant small understory trees such as redbuds, dogwoods, or serviceberry without the negative impacts to vehicles or pedestrians caused by the lower canopy height. The benefit is that the new street tree lawns will add a green welcome to downtown Main Street while preserving the existing parallel parking spaces throughout this segment. This image is a rough sketch of what the proposed eastern segment design can look like on Main Street.
Finally, as we get to the east, we find a lot of interesting places where land is underused and where new residential development could take place. One of the sites that in our previous surveying on this project with you stuck out as being one that people wanted to see redeveloped was the south side of Church between John and Bernard that are currently occupied by older mobile homes. And it's an interesting opportunity for an affordable housing development that uses a small house or a cottage house that's similar in square footage or even a little bit larger than a mobile home, but can provide a much more permanent setting. The important landmark here is Holy Childhood. And you'll see in our next part ideas for how that can work and be connected to Main Street, which we think is very important in terms of taking advantage of that wonderful landmark. So those are our ideas in very quick summary, which you can study at your leisure for the segments of the Main Street study area. And in our next section of the presentation, we'll be looking at what some of those individual sites might look like.